I'm very pleased to introduce Joan Sigel Schuman, class of 62, who's going to moderate our conversation on teaching. Joan is the executive director of the Collaborative for Educational Services in Northampton. And the thing that I have learned about Joan and admire most is that she seems to know everything about education in Massachusetts. If you want to know something, just ask her. She knows everything about it. So,
because I've been around for so long.
Okay, there you go. So, Joan and panelists.
Thank you. And I have been around a long time. You can read all about me, not all about me, in the brochure, so I won't go into that, but I do want to introduce our wonderful panelists today who epitomize what Tori talked about, what Carol Chris talked about, and what Tori quoted every Smith president having said. These are very dedicated, wonderful teachers who are teaching in our most difficult school districts and cities in this country. I've got to forget. Rachel Willis of the class of 2004 is to my immediate left. Sitting next to her is Kayleigh Colombero, class of 2008. And at the end of the table, all the way from Mexico, just to come and visit with us today, is Ileana Jiménez, class of 97. I thought this was going to be in the other room in a very informal setting and sort of like a fireside chat, and I feel very constrained behind this table, but I'll try. We really want to make this as informal as possible, and we want to have some time for a give and take at the end of this, toward the end of the session. So our panelists will talk a little bit about themselves and what they do, answer a couple of questions for me, and then we'll open it up for your wonderful questions, which we've already seen will tax the best of us, I'm sure. As I mentioned, these young women teach in our most difficult urban environments, which have really been the primary focus of our politicians, our policymakers, and the communities that we live in throughout the country. Education policy has changed in this country. When I started teaching well, you know I graduated in 62, so I started teaching in 63. That's 1963. Sometimes it feels like 1863. It's a long time ago. But education was a local matter, and it was really only a local matter. It started to become a state matter and a little bit of a federal interest in the mid-60s. And in fact, I was lucky enough to be the recipient of the first wave of funding that came through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was passed in 1965 when money started rolling out, the little bit of 7% money, but for us it was a big percent, rolling out for materials and supplies. And I remember spending a summer just having this glorious opportunity to fill a library full of history and social studies books at the high school where I was teaching. In more recent years, starting with the passage of the infamously called No Child Left Behind, but which is really another reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the federal government became much more intrusive in our lives. And as was mentioned this morning, it is continuing to demand more from us, which is a good thing, give us less to work with, which is a bad thing, but certainly putting more of an onus on states to comply with federal mandates. And so teaching is no longer within the domain of our local cities and towns, but has changed somewhat over the years. And I guess one of my questions will be whether that has impacted the lives of the women you see in front of you with their teaching. But first, I'd like them to begin to talk a little bit about their teaching environments. First, why they went into teaching, what inspired them to go into teaching, and something about the demographics of the students they find themselves teaching today. We'll start with you.
All right. I currently teach third grade in Atlanta Public Schools. Coming to Smith, I already had my plan mapped out on what I was going to do. All the students in my high school used to call me Senator Willis because I already knew I was going to come to Smith, I was going to major in government, I was going to the Picker program, and after that I wanted to be on Capitol Hill. So I came to Smith, I majored in government, I did the Picker program, and then something happened my senior year. In the fall, the campus was just littered with all of these Teach for America info session signs, and there was chalk all over the sidewalks about come to this session and see what you can do for your country. And after a while, just seeing all these blue signs popping up everywhere, I felt like I was being stalked. And I was like, okay, I will go to the info session already. So I go to the info session, and I'm sitting there, and there's a teacher, and she's in grad school now, and she's talking about her experience, and she has what looks like the science project board with pictures of her classroom. And then at the very end, a video comes on about Teach for America and its mission that one day all children in this nation will have an opportunity to attain an excellent education. And by the end of the video, the lights came back up, and I realized I was crying. And I didn't know what it was, and it just kind of stuck with me. So over the course of that semester, I still had in my head, okay, well, I'm probably going to go to government, but the recruitment director just stayed on top of me. Walking in the campus center, I actually remember the seat she would sit in every week and say, when are you going to apply? When are you going to apply? That's not a usual reaction to start crying, so I know you're going to apply. And by my senior year, I'd actually finished all of my requirements for my major. So I started asking people around campus, you know, if there's one class you could take, what would it be? And I don't want to embarrass anybody in here, but I kept hearing that salmon traders class was the class that you needed to take. And having never taken a course in education, but kind of having it in the back of my head, maybe I should apply to Teach for America, I decided to take that class. And for me, it was really life-changing. The opportunities that I had in there to work with students in a mentoring program and also teaching drama at an aftercare program as part of the requirements really showed me, you know, this is what I'm actually supposed to be doing. And maybe I'm not going to be Senator Willis. Maybe I'm going to be Miss Willis. So I went ahead and I applied. And the moment I stepped into the classroom and I saw how impactful being a teacher was, that's when I decided to stay. And so I started in 2004, and this is my 7th year teaching now.
Kayleigh.
I had a similar path to Rachel. My mother was a teacher, so it sounds like I probably would have wanted to go into education, but I was also raised by a single mother when teaching paid even worse than it does now. So even when I was 6 and I told my mom I was going to be a teacher, she said, no, it doesn't make enough money. Of course, she also said only smart, rich girls came to Smith, and I still made it, so. So when I came to Smith, I wanted to major in English literature, which I did, and attend law school and make the big bucks. And then I met Salmon Trader and took his education class, so somebody needs to pay him more. And I fell in love, and I had a friend at Smith who was going into teaching. She was a year ahead of me, and she said, there's nothing better we can do with our brains than become teachers. And I felt like it was okay for me to use all of my intelligence and my hard work and my determination for teaching, even though my stepdad asked me why I was going into teaching because I was brilliant. But I still felt like this is where our young, smart women should be going once I took Sam's class. And so I started off after college, my first year after college, I taught in Hadley, just down the road, which is a suburban district, very wealthy, one high school. We had plenty of supplies. I had a Promethean board fully mounted in my room, so I always had technology on hand. And after 2 years of teaching, I was bored. I was being told after my observations that I was great, there was really nothing to work on, and I felt like after 2 years of teaching, that's not where I should be. So I decided to start teaching in Springfield, where I've been teaching this year at a public magnet school, the Springfield Renaissance School, and we're an expeditionary learning school as well. So we get just typical public school kids. We don't, take any sort of, it's just a random lottery. but it's very challenging and very rewarding in ways that I didn't find I was getting those rewards in Hadley. So I'll talk a little more about that as we continue.
Ileana.
Thank you, Joan. I just want to start out by saying this is probably the highlight of my Fulbright during my time in Mexico right now. I'm spending 6 months in Mexico City conducting research on issues of gender and sexuality in high schools on the ground there in the city. And one of the things that I've been looking forward to this whole time is coming back here and being surrounded by all of my fellow educators, but also Smith women, to help me continue this work in a really inspired way. So thank you. I have a different story to tell. I don't teach in a public school. I teach in independent. I've always been in independent schools, and I'll share with you why. I graduated in 1997, and when I went on my job search that spring, I took out an old article that I had found my first year of college. There used to be a feminist newspaper called Sojourner, and it was based in Boston. And I don't even think it runs anymore. It does? Great. I had purchased a copy of Sojourner my very first year of college because on the cover of the newspaper was girls sitting at a desk, and it was a story about the Young Women's Leadership School, and at that time that was just starting in Harlem in New York. And I remember keeping this article tucked away in a box in my Lawrence House room for years, and really dreaming of the day when I would someday teach at the Young Women's Leadership School in Harlem. And the spring of my senior year, I somehow strong-armed, or I took some power, as Tori said, and I secured myself an interview there. And the reason why I thought I would somehow get a job, an offer, something, I was a little bit naive, was because Ruth Simmons, who was the president at the time, had just been there and had spoken to the students and had encouraged them to apply to Smith, and she wanted to create this partnership between the Young Women's Leadership School and Smith. And I got there, and it was the worst interview, or one of the worst interviews I think I've ever had. And the reason why was because she, the principal, was not at all interested in having me as a teacher. I kept offering myself for free. I said, I don't even have to be paid. I could just intern, I could sit in the back, I can observe, I can tutor after school, I can do whatever. No. So I came back to campus pretty dejected and pretty rejected. And I made an appointment right away with President Ruth Simmons, and I said, what happened? Why did that happen? You were just there. I thought maybe I could, ride on your coattails a little bit. And she said, Ileana, sit down. And she sat me down at her desk in College Hall, and she said, this is the beginning of the rest of your life. Forever, people are going to be threatened by you because you have a Smith education. And she was 100% right. My entire 14 years in teaching has been many struggles, many battles, many achievements, many triumphs, but all due because I went to Smith. So my dream of teaching in a girls' school, a public girls' school, wound up kind of shifting a bit, and I had to start teaching in private girls' schools. So I went down to Baltimore, and I taught in girls' schools there, and I taught in Washington, D.C., and I taught in a girls' school there, and then eventually came back to New York, and I now teach at a small progressive school founded by Elizabeth Irwin, who is also a Smith alum. I gave up, temporarily I think, teaching in single-sex schools to go to LREI, but that's just the beginning of my story.
Well, we would like to continue that story. with your talking about how your background, both personal and educational, you've mentioned your Smith education, affected or influenced your choice of going into teaching. Can you all hear me? I'm supposed to talk into the mic and I'm not doing that. We'll start with you since.
Great, thank you. I'll start with another story, which is that a few years ago, I visited my grandmother in Puerto Rico. Both of my parents are from Puerto Rico. And I really wanted to capture my grandmother's story because I knew that none of my family members had gone to college. I'm probably one of a handful of members in my entire family who went to college. And I was certainly a first-generation student here. And so I went back to visit my grandmother in Puerto Rico, and I interviewed her, and I talked to her about school, and I said, "What was school like for you?" And she said, "I only went to school for 1 year of my life." And I said, "Well, what was that 1 year like?" And she said, "I absolutely loved it. I always had my hand up. I was always raising my hand. I loved school. I had all A's. In fact, the teacher kept telling me to put down my hand." And then I thought, this is my Smith DNA, right? Like, she never went to Smith. She never went to elementary school barely. But I knew that by talking to her, that I had found something that was my imprint, which was to love school. So there's my Latina identity. And then there's also my feminist identity, my queer identity, that all of those identities I bring to bear in my teaching. And I would ever erase issues of race or class or gender or sexuality, because all of that informs who I am and how I navigate the classroom. And I think if any of us are thinking that we can't erase that, I think our students know when we're not being real with them. In fact, I know they're not. They know it because I was closeted for a good number of years during my first years of teaching, for 7 years. And it affected my emotional and mental and physical health. I was deteriorating inside because I couldn't come out to my students. There I was in girls' schools telling them to be all empowered, telling them to be all feminist and fierce, when really the person standing in front of them wasn't doing the same thing. So I had to take it upon myself to go through a certain healing process to become a whole person and ultimately a whole teacher. And I think it's critical for all of us to come into our classrooms as whole people.
Kayleigh, you talked a little bit about coming from a family of teachers, but you made a major move by moving from Hadley to Springfield, and I'm wondering whether your background and experiences growing up led you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that my mom always taught me to do the unexpected, so I guess that was something that I was prepared to do. But also, coming from teachers, I knew that my first 2 years of teaching, I wouldn't necessarily be strong enough to offer my best services. And that's what I wanted to offer to the children of Springfield, because as I can tell you now, they're amazing and brilliant and offer that to me. So I purposely chose to teach somewhere that I felt would be more within my comfort zone for the first 2 years to get certain things under my belt before I could take on the urban district. But also part of my background that led me to Springfield was that I came to Smith on a full scholarship from a public high school. And I'm pretty sure I was one of the only people in the history of my high school to come to Smith, because everybody just asked why I would want to be around women all the time and thought I was strange. But it changed me, because when I got here, I, for the first time, felt really challenged. I felt that my education wasn't as good as other people's, and I felt angry about that. I had a professor sit me down and tell me that I couldn't write. Literally, that I would never get an A in English literature classes because I couldn't write. And I was mad. How could I get to Smith? How could I get the SAT scores I got? How could I be first in my class at high school and not write? I mean, what was happening in my school that occurred? And I didn't grow up in an urban area. I grew up in a very rural area in the northern Berkshires, which has its own difficulties. But I felt really cheated. And I think that when I started working in college with kids in Springfield, I identified with their sense of feeling cheated. You know, what did I do that the kid in Hadley did differently to get those teachers and that much money per student, you know? I mean, in Springfield, it's even worse because you've got Longmeadow 10 minutes away. I mean, how can you not wake up every day and feel like you're being told you're not the same when there's not as much spending, there's not as experienced teachers, you don't have certified teachers in all of your classrooms, you don't have the same technology. And I think that sense of just feeling cheated that I felt when I got to Smith really made me want to teach in schools where kids were maybe feeling that way.
Thank you. If it makes you feel any better, 50 years ago, many of us were told when we came to Smith that we couldn't write.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I still remember that. English 1-1. It's not called that anymore, though, is
It's
it?
101 now.
Rachel, when we had our pre-discussion, you told us a wonderful story, and I'm hoping that you will relate that story to us, all of us, today.
So when I was in 4th grade, my mother sued my school system. And here's why. We recently had just been remodeled and everything was wonderful and beautiful, and we came back to our new campus and we would go to the playground and we could go to the wonderful gym set, or we could go play on the construction equipment that had been left. And I'm sorry, but it is much cooler to play on construction equipment than it is to go play on the jungle gym that you're used to. And my mother had a problem with this, obviously. I was like, when is everything going to get moved? What is happening? And she started writing letters to the principal, and it became a problem. And my principal sent a memo out to all the teachers saying that my mother was no longer allowed in the school building, that she was an agitator, and to watch her. And, of course, one teacher anonymously mailed this letter to our house. And so then my mother and a small group of other parents in the school started doing investigating to see, well, if something as serious as this, where you're telling me not only am I a parent, but I'm a taxpayer, that I can't be in the building, and you're stopping me the moment that I come to the threshold, what else is going on that's wrong in this school? And she uncovered that there was a lot of inequity going on the south side of the county where we lived on, and the majority of the resources were being sent to the northern side where everything was affluent. There was a book in my library that said, "One day man will go to the moon." And that was where she had enough. But the problem is that with teachers being told from their administration that you have to isolate this child, that's exactly what they did. And so I was pulled from extracurriculars. I was told that I couldn't join certain programs. My friends that I used to have play dates with and sleepovers told me now that my mother was a problem and that they weren't allowed to hang out with me. So at 9 and 10 years old, I was in therapy. And I was at the point of wanting to commit suicide because of how I was being treated in school. I didn't understand how I could be a student, doing what I'm told, making A's, and yet no one wanted to be around me. And it got to a point where my father said, "We can't do this anymore. We have to transfer her." And my aunt was a principal in Atlanta Public Schools. And so my parents actually gave up guardianship of me to put me in Atlanta Public Schools, to go to a different school, just to kind of have relief from everything that was going on, even though the lawsuit was still happening. And going to Atlanta Public Schools, the teacher there, they knew what was happening. It was in the newspapers, and they were like, "When you come here, it's only about learning. We're not going to focus on anything else. We're not going to talk about it. We're just here to educate you." And for me, it was extremely powerful. So I went to that middle school, and I went to the high school that it fed into. And at one point, enrollment got too high because it was one of the most popular schools. And my principal said, "I'm not letting you go. If I lose my job, you're going to graduate at this high school." And when I came to Smith, I was intimidated. And I was like, "Oh, everybody's so smart here." And my sister actually was a Smithie, and hands down, she's way smarter than I am. And so I was like, if you fit in, I'm not going to fit in. And I came, and I noticed within a few months that people were coming to me and asking me to edit their papers and asking them for help studying. And I was like, wait a minute. I went to Grady High School in the heart of Atlanta, and you're coming to me, and you went to private schools? And so at that point, I really started to understand the value. It's not where you went to school, it's who taught you when you were there. And that always stuck with me. And I really wanted to go back to Atlanta. So when I joined Teach for America, it wasn't just because I wanted to make sure that everyone had an excellent education. It was because I remembered that hour-long commute that I had to make each day to get that education, and I wanted to eliminate that for students. I remember that feeling of what it's like when your teacher just passes you the paper and walks away, but then goes to the person next to you and says, "I'm so proud of you, I love you." I remember that feeling of coming here and realizing how lucky I was, and that I was here and I was able to hold my own at a community like Smith College with so many powerful women because of the teachers who didn't give up on me. And so for me, that was the reason that I went into teaching. It's the reason I returned to Atlanta to teach. And actually today, I work at the elementary school that feeds into the middle school and high school that I went to. So I feel like everything's come full circle. I'm preparing the students that will take the same journey that I took. And I hope that their outcomes will become the same as mine.
Thank you. Clearly, I think everyone deserves a little bit of applause on that one. You clearly belie the notion or the reality, perhaps, that not the best teachers get put in the worst classrooms. So thank you for doing what you do. The public generally thinks that teachers have complete autonomy when deciding what to teach and how to teach in their classrooms. They get to close the doors behind them, and that can be good, and it can also be very bad because it can be very isolating. How much ability do you really have to control what you do in your classroom, what you do in the environment, what you can teach, and has the movement towards standards affected your teaching in any way? Do you want to start with that?
Sure. I found that the amount of control you have over your classroom really depends on the leader at your school. During my Teach for America commitment and continuing on teaching, I've actually taught at 4 public schools in the city of Atlanta, all within 5 miles of each other. And in some schools, you had to be doing the same exact lesson that all the other teachers in the classroom were doing at the same exact time, and if you were not on track, then that was a problem, and you had a meeting at the end of the day. The school I teach at now, as long as your students have the right test scores, they don't care what approach you're making, as long as when they come in, you're teaching the state standards. So I feel like that has something big to do with it. I feel like it's really important to allow teachers to have that sense of autonomy in their classroom so that the way that I teach may not be the same way that Kayleigh teaches, but as long as we're having an impact on students and we're constantly seeing them grow, then that's something that's important. But I feel like one of the problems with education today is that we're not necessarily respected as professionals, even though we're told that we're going to be nation builders. You don't treat us as nation builders. You treat us as someone that you have to hold accountable for everything without acknowledging the fact that we're here for a reason. We come with a knowledgeable background, and we know the different steps that we need to get students there. And so I feel like that's one of the hindrances that we face in education, just really giving teachers the opportunity to do what they learned how to do.
Kayleigh.
So my school that I'm at right now, I would say that I'm spoiled with a great amount of autonomy, but also a wonderful amount of supervision and support from my supervisor. Because I work at an expeditionary learning school, we don't grade on a 1 to 100 or an ABCD scale. We do what's called standard-based grading, so we create for our course our own learning targets. So, the one we're working on right now is that they can compare the governments of ancient Greece to the government of the United States, which it fits with the state and national standards, but I essentially created that on my own. I was allowed to create that, and so we'll do 2 assessments to decide whether or not, after I prepare them for the assessments, we decide whether or not that kid meets that learning target. So they get a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. They get a 4 if they're exceeding the target, which is like they're doing wonderful. They get a 3 if they're just meeting the target, and a 2 and a 1 are below the target or no evidence of the target. And so it's really different than most of the Massachusetts ways of grading and teaching and building curriculum, because I get to make my entirely own assessment map where I have my learning targets, the ways I'm going to prepare my kids for the assessments, and the assessments I'm giving on those learning targets, which with my supervisor's help and the head of my department, I'm allowed to create entirely individually. I don't know that that would work everywhere. I think you have to really have a good scaffolding system. I work a lot with the other history teachers so that we can align things, because we're a 6 through 12 school and we make sure that everything works together. And I work a lot with my supervisor, who is not only a magnet school leader but an expeditionary learning school leader, and so he has a wealth of knowledge about teaching using standards-based grading. But originally I was in a school where I had to cover the whole curriculum, and I had to do it in this amount of time, and I had to be, there was another teacher teaching the same class. So if I was a day behind that teacher, it was my fault, and why did I get a day behind, and how am I gonna catch it up? And I hated that, because I just felt like students bring a lot of authentic questions to your classroom, and if you can never build space in for their voices and their questions, then what are we telling them about them coming to school? It's almost like they're not even necessary. And I felt that that was happening in my classroom, that I'd have to say, well, we can't talk about that because I have to move on. And I remember kids would ask me questions about me getting my master's, which I saw my mother put herself through her master's program, and I feel like it was the #1 reason why I wanted an education, watching my single mom work for her master's. And so anytime a kid asks me a question about education, I'm just kind of like, oh, okay. Let's have a moment. So you get your bachelor's, then you get your master's, and I go through the whole thing, and I say, anybody can go. I went to Smith for free. And they're like, no, you didn't. Yes, I did. And so I tell them all this because I think it's so important, but you can't do that if you're on a pacer, like Rachel said, if you have to be on the same place as the teacher across the hall, or the teacher in another school, or God forbid, the teacher in another district. There's just no way you can take student voice and make it authentic in your classroom, so.
Student voice, Ileana.
The first 7 years of my teaching life, I taught in girls' schools, and one of the things that I learned a lot of things in both settings that I was in. One of the things I learned was how to create a curriculum, how to design a syllabus, all of those kind of logistical things. But I think one of the things that I really wanted, more than the logistics, was vision. I don't think that curriculum should just be about content. I think it should be about some kind of larger vision that you want your students to be able to accomplish and achieve with you in the classroom. What's the journey that you're going to be taking your students on throughout the course of a year, and hitting particular moments that will make that vision happen together? And I was really lacking that a lot during the first kind of 7 years of my teaching, mostly because I was doing a lot of things on my own. And I didn't have a lot of control, so to speak, of what I was teaching or how I was teaching it. I had to be kind of lockstep with my colleagues. And I finally really just got tired of that. I wasn't growing as a teacher. I wasn't allowed to bring my own particular vision to girls' schools in particular, which, frankly, when I came to girls' schools, I thought I was just going to enter kind of mini Smith, and it wasn't that at all. In fact, I really think that, if anything, girls' schools really need to redesign the way they function in many ways, because so much of what I learned at a women's college is not necessarily always happening at the girls' school level, in particular on issues of kind of intersectional ways of looking at the world, looking at race, looking at class, looking at gender, looking at sexuality, looking at politics in a way that's about institutional change. There's a difference between empowerment and change. So I really found myself kind of hitting my head against the wall during those first few years, and really, for example, I wanted to teach a research paper based on women's issues, and this was at a girls' school, and I was called in by parents saying, why are you teaching your feminist agenda? And I thought, wow, this is really difficult, even in a setting where you would think it would be welcomed. Now I teach in a small progressive school in New York, And I have a great deal of autonomy to design the kinds of courses that I really want to share with my students. But the expertise that I bring has a certain limit. My students are also a part of creating the courses with me. I teach a course on feminism, I teach a course on LGBT literature, I teach a course on writing memoir, a seminar on Toni Morrison, and all of those courses I design with the intention of a particular journey that I want my students to go on. For example, in my feminism course, I might teach them intersectionality theory about race, class, gender, and sexuality, but you can only take a theory for so long. They need to be able to apply that to themselves, and so they take the theory and they write about who they are based on identity and how they navigate the world based on identity. But then they also learn about larger issues beyond that are also affected by issues of race and class and gender. What do I mean by that? I show them a documentary, for example, by an organization called GEMS. And GEMS stands for Girls Educational and Mentoring Services. And GEMS essentially works to bring young women out of sex trafficking. The official term is more like CSEC, which stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. And the average age of young women being trafficked in New York City is 13. The students that I have watch this documentary. They're very moved by it. But that's not all. I then invite the outreach workers from GEMS, who were once trafficked themselves, to come in and talk to my students. My students then put on an assembly for the entire community, teaching their peers about CSEC, about sex trafficking, right in their own city. I'm not talking about global trafficking, I'm talking about right in their own communities. And then we have a partnership with GEMS where we created a coffee house. We fundraised for them. We've given them a kind of partnership together. All of that is to say that we can't just keep what we're doing tied to just the classroom. We need to be able to bring it outward, bring theory to practice, make it come to an action step, not just the content on its own, but something that's going to make change in the larger world. And the students who have gone through this class and other classes that I've taught come back to me and say, now I'm taking, gender studies in college or ethnic studies in college or what have you. And I think that to me is one of the most rewarding things I could possibly give to my students, is a sense of continuity and a sense of vision for creating the rest of their educational lives.
Thank you, Ileana. There's been a great deal of concern that our best and brightest teachers, particularly women, do not stay in the profession. They go for 2 or 3 years because they haven't decided exactly what they want to do. And then they go on to graduate school, they go on to other opportunities that are open to them. How do you take care of yourselves intellectually and emotionally so that you remain excited, remain creative, and remain in the profession? Would you like to start with that one?
Sure.
Haven't figured out how to start in the middle yet. We could start with Kayleigh. Let's start with Kayleigh.
Okay. For me, it's really about my colleagues and the people that I surround myself with inside and outside of work. The school that I'm at right now, I actually really chose. I sent my application in a week before school started this year, so it was kind of a big change on short notice. But I was getting my master's with a friend who worked there, and she talked about it all the time. And it was the absolute reverse of most faculty room discussions, which was super positive, how much she's learning from her other teachers. And she's been a teacher for 6 years, and she's still learning from all the other teachers. And I feel that way about the school that I'm in. I feel like every single person I work for has something, or work with, has something to offer me. And I haven't always been in schools that are like that, but I really respect my colleagues, and we have a lot of fun together. I knew I made the right move. The day I showed up, our first day of training, we played Capture the Flag outside in the woods. Now, I mean, I'm sure you've been to teacher trainings, and most of us know they are not usually team building or fun. So I was just like, I found it. I'm staying here forever, and I'm not going to tell you that you don't have to pay me because I want to get paid, but you don't have to. And so that's been really important to me in building friendships with other teachers so that, I mean, so you go out with your friends, with your teaching friends, or you go to a gathering and you end up talking about teaching all night. I know you've done it, and your students all night, right? And your boyfriends and your husbands can't understand, and they kind of get irritated with you. All you ever talk about is teaching. But you have to do that kind of like debriefing about your day and about your year and about the challenges and the struggles and the accomplishments. And so I surround myself with people who I can do that with. And then the other thing that I found really sustaining is this is actually the third time this year I've spoke at Smith College about teaching. It's really sustaining for me to feel like this is an issue that matters. This is something that I can get other people excited about. This is something that other people are already excited about. And to have that kind of positive reinforcement about teaching and the work that we do, I think is really important. And lastly is yoga. You just cannot be a teacher without a good deal of yoga. And when I set my goals with my students for their fitness, they know Ms. Colombero's goal is yoga, and sometimes they have to yell at me because I don't get to my yoga during the week, and they can tell, but that's definitely a thing for me too. So.
Ileana.
I'm really lucky in that I teach in a department where every single colleague I have, which is essentially 3 other women, we really take care of each other. And I haven't always had that experience, though. I've taught in schools where it was really about you going into the classroom, closing the door, doing your thing, and then going home and grading, and going into your weekend and continuing to grade, and then coming back on Monday. And there wasn't a sense of collaboration or even vision making together. But now I teach in a school where I cannot imagine creating my curriculum without the help, the guidance, the expertise of my colleagues. And I think that's what really sustains me, is that I actually really respect my colleagues. I actually respect their expertise, and in turn, they respect mine. And I don't even have a chair necessarily. I mean, at our school, we have kind of these department coordinators, but this particular person doesn't necessarily have an evaluative role. And so my colleagues and I really are a team, and we bolster each other's work. The other thing that I think really bolsters my own particular spirit is the fact that I'm now on this Fulbright. I've been teaching for 14 years, and I'm a really hard worker in the classroom. I do a lot of things with my students that are about really hitting the ground and bringing the classroom to life. I brought my students to speak at the TEDx Youth Conference back in the fall at the Hewitt School, and I had to essentially train my students to speak publicly about telling their stories. You know, what are the things that made them come to a particular consciousness in their lives, and that was the stories that they told. I brought them to the Spark Summit in the fall in New York, where the Spark Summit was an event that launched a movement against the sexualization of girls and women in the media. I bring them all over the place, all over New York City. And so I'm constantly planning, changing, shaping, designing. I'm not just located in one place. After 14 years, that's really tiring, and that's really exhausting, especially when you're kind of the only one doing it. And so I really felt that applying for a Fulbright at this time in my particular phase in my career was important. And the Fulbright that I'm doing is not a teacher exchange. Most people think of Fulbright teachers as the exchange, where you kind of work in a host country, but that's not what I'm doing. There's a new Fulbright called the Distinguished Fulbright Award in Teaching, and it's only for experienced teachers who have at least, I think, 3 to 5 years of teaching, a master's degree, and then the final requirement, which I think is such a critical requirement, is that you have experience delivering professional development to other teachers. And because I've led workshops and trainings at conferences and at schools on issues ranging from inclusive curricula to writing-based practices to a whole range of LGBT workshops, et cetera, I can say that I've been able to deliver that kind of professional development to teachers, and that will actually count as my experience of delivering that for teachers, and that is a part of what the Fulbright was looking for. So this time and this money, essentially, that I'm getting is to conduct research abroad in Mexico on issues that are really pertinent to me as an educator in my work in diversity practice, but also in change, in inclusion. And so that's I think that's probably the most important thing, is how do we give teachers the money, the resources, the time to become intellectually stimulated public intellectuals, contributing to the discourse, creating change, creating innovation, but giving them that time and support to do so.
Rachel, how do you stay motivated?
Well, it's certainly not yoga because LA Fitness gets my money every month and I never go. I think with me, it's definitely the little things. I create a lot of songs. I'm very cheesy. I talk in voices in my classroom. Hearing my students by this time of year charging themselves with making new accents and singing the songs that I've created, that for me is always like, aha, you think you're singing and getting away with it, but really you're practicing your latitude and longitude. And then constantly pushing myself. I just completed my master's program in education leadership at Columbia this past year, and being in an environment where I was supported and challenged, and that was something that was really important to me, to be able to go back to school again. I'm very fortunate to be a part of the TFA network, which just when you feel like I'm getting exhausted, do I really need to be here? Here comes another inspirational speaker coming to town to be like, yes, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And then just seeking out events like this. One of my friends actually said the other night, are you excited about going back to Smith to speak? I'm like, are you kidding me? Everybody says that Disney World is the most magical place on earth. But that's because they didn't go to Smith. And I feel like being here and being among colleagues who have the same mission as me is something that really sustains me. Now, my focus going forward is to find those things, like my mother says, every week on Tuesday and Thursday, you should be at the gym. Because that's what I'm paying for my yoga that I'm not going to. So my new goal, because I'm very goal-oriented, is to try and carve out that time for myself. But right now, just seeing the difference that I'm making in my students and that I make in my school and in the system is really what pushes me to continue.
I have one last question before I open it up to questions. Ever since, I think, maybe with Mary Maples done, but certainly when Ruth Simmons came to campus and I had come back to Northampton for the particular position I'm still in. I had come back for a year. I'm here 18 years later. It's the proximity to the Smith campus, which I rarely get up to, but nonetheless, it's there in the air. But I, for one, have been very concerned about the fact that far more options are available to Smith women today than they were in my day. In my day, we either became social workers, teachers, or nurses, and didn't have the opportunities that all of you have. So I have been concerned about how we increase the number of bright women, particularly Smith women, who see pre-collegiate teaching as a good career choice. And I'd like you to now sock it to the administration. No, suggest to the administration how you would increase the pool of young women today who have all of these options in front of them to go into the teaching profession. So we'll start with you.
I'm very opinionated about this. You giving me more money, while is appreciated, is not going to make me join a field or stay in it for longer. I didn't come into teaching because I wanted to make a lot of money. I spend a good chunk of my check actually pouring it back into my classroom or buying presents for my students, and that's something where even they say, Ms. Willis, why are you buying all this stuff? Can't you get it donated? It actually makes me feel good to be able to do it for them. So you giving me more money just means that I'm going to be spending that extra money on them. But what I do feel is that we need to have a shift in the way we approach people into the field of education. It shouldn't be, oh, well, those who can't teach, that's not true. I feel like those who can become teachers so that you can too. And I also feel that we need to understand where we are. With statistics so high of the number of students who are not going to do well, it can't any longer be about go into teaching because you want to play with little children. It needs to be go into teaching because you want to see the face of the United States change for the next generation. You need to be able to understand, and I think we don't do a very good job preparing people for this and letting them know how important the field of education is, that what you do in the classroom today is going to impact how our society is tomorrow. If you really want to see us competing with different nations, then what you need to do is build up the teaching profession and make sure that we're providing a quality education to teachers, because not all teacher preparation programs are created equal, and encouraging those teachers students from top universities and top colleges like Smith into going into that field. Not for a paycheck, not because somebody's going to be impressed with your title, but because you're making a difference. I didn't join teaching necessarily just to be a teacher, but because I remember the impact that education had on me as a child. And I've been hearing a lot lately the buzzword that being in education is actually part of the civil rights movement for us today. And I do feel it's true. When I was at Columbia 2 summers ago, my father was helping me unpack, and then he got really quiet. And he's in his 70s, and so whenever he gets quiet, I get hyperactive. Like, are you okay? Do you need to sit down? Am I pushing you too much? He's like, I'm fine. I'm having a moment. And so I asked him what his moment was, and he said that growing up as a child in segregation, that he never expected and he never envisioned the opportunity of being able to help his child move into an Ivy League institution, that this was beyond anything he'd ever dreamed for himself. He thought when he was able to afford a house, that was it, that he'd reached his goal. And so this, for me, I don't think that that should be an exception or that should be a moment for anyone. It should be an expectation. So that's why I'm in the field of education. That's why I'm going to stay in it, because I want to create that opportunity where you no longer have to stop and take a pause because you're surprised that your family has gone beyond what society envisioned for them. It needs to be the absolute expectation.
Ileana.
I see my work as an educator as a form of activism, and when I actually introduce myself sometimes I say I'm an educator activist. I don't separate those two identities because I feel that everything I do every day is a form of activism. And my students know that too. I'm not the kind of person who has a kind of the philosophy in her head and kind of doesn't outwardly share that with their students. My students are very aware of the kind of life I live outside of school. There was an alum, I don't know your name. What was your name about doing all the things you do outside of your, Anna? I was struck by what you said because they know that I sit on the board of the Estrella Foundation. They know that it funds LGBT organizations across the nation. They know that I lead an LGBT educators group. They know all the things that I do outside of school because I am not just their teacher. I'm also an activist outside of the school, and I'm an activist inside the school. And I think it's important for our students to see us in multidimensional ways, or they will only see education as a service rather than as something that provides them with things that are going to actually open their eyes up to many things beyond the classroom. The other thing I want to say is that I really think it's important that the piece about self-care is really critical here, which is that when I was in my first 7 years of teaching, I developed all kinds of health problems, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. And the reason why was because I wasn't being true to myself, and I wasn't being true to my students, and I wasn't being true to my colleagues. And I don't think that schools do enough to take care of their teachers. What are the ways in which we can take care of them with the yoga, with everything else, but also with their emotional lives, their psychological lives. And I'm not just talking about necessarily funding for things like therapy. I'm talking about, like, how are you actually feeling every single day in the classroom? What is the self-care that teachers need? The other piece that I really think is critical, at least for myself, I mean, your question really is about, how are we actually attracting people? For myself, I'm not just an English teacher. I don't just teach literature. I teach I'm interested in a wide variety of particular activities outside of school, and I think that we need to bring that into the classroom. And our students need to be able to engage with that beyond what we actually teach them. And when we do that kind of work with students, we also need to say, you are not the leaders of tomorrow, but you're actually doing something today. I actually don't buy into the rhetoric of, well, you're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. That's kind of like a blank check. Like, what actually are we saying to them when we say to young people, you're going to be leading the country in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Are we actually giving them the skills to do that today? And I think that part is really critical. Regarding pay, I actually do think that teachers need to be paid more. I'm 36 years old, and I still cannot afford to buy a home. I think that is completely unfair. I have classmates from Smith who not only have a home, but they have summer homes. I don't necessarily need a summer home. But the purchasing power of that says that their job is valued, right? I want to be able to purchase all kinds of things from my classroom, but I can't because I'm paying the rent in New York City. So what are the things that are being valued here in terms of pay? It's not just about what we can buy, but it's about what we value. And I just can't, I refuse to go into my 40s without being able to say that I bought something for myself, a home. I think that's critical.
Thank you. Kayleigh, what advice would you give to your former professors here at Smith,
Well,
and the
if I-
Smith administration?
If
to
I could
encourage
make
people?
Sam and Trader's class a requirement, I would do that first.
Do
But
we have to clone Sam?
yes. But also, I would say having more teachers come to campus, young teachers who just left Smith and they can really identify with that, I'm just choosing this, or even experienced teachers who have found a life in the profession and can talk about how great that life has been, I think would really bring more Smith women into the profession. I think what Ileana spoke of about the pay, our country tends to demoralize teachers in a lot of ways. A lot of what's in the media is negative. And so as a young college student, it feels kind of scary to choose a profession that at once is loved, but also kind of demoralized. And so I felt like my family would be mad at me for choosing teaching, and in fact, some of them were. And so I think we need to do more of, whether it's giving professional pay, so that encourages people to see it as a real profession. I mean, my sister's about to be a dentist, and I think about what she does in her day and what she gets paid for doing, and what I do in my day and what I get paid for doing, and we can barely have conversations with each other because of it. And I just think that we do need to value teaching more, and if that means higher pay, or if that means just doing a better job of valuing it within our communities and in the media in our country, and having more teachers speak out about the great parts of our profession and the wonderful children that we get to work with. I know for me, something that's super important about teaching at Springfield is telling people all the time how amazing my students are, because difficult districts get the reputation that their students are rude and disrespectful and don't appreciate the teachers, and that's just not the case. And I think more teachers need to talk about that. Like, my students love me. They say I love you, and I say I love you back. Do you get that at your job?
It's so cool.
So I just think really talking up teaching and doing a better job of that will lead us there.
Well, I love all of you, I have to say. You've done a wonderful job in describing how wonderful the profession can be, and as someone who has been in the profession in a variety of roles for close to 50 years, I'm just so pleased to be associated with such a fine group of representatives, not only of Smith College, but of the teaching profession. So thank you very, very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so we want to get as many questions as possible, which means no speeches, please, and short answers. Yes?
Advice for those like my daughter who are knocking on the door teaching, you're all lucky you're employed. We're lucky we're employed. What about these new teachers now who are waiting for that first job? How'd you get yours? How'd it work for you?
Well, for me, I actually joined Teach for America, so that system was a little bit easier because once you actually get accepted into the program and you're placed with the school district automatically finds a school home for you. But my suggestion would be doing what Ileana offered when she went to her first interview, just offering that opportunity to come in and even intern and volunteer at the school so that you're able to build a relationship, so that when there is an opportunity to hire a new teacher, you're the first person that they're going to think of. Working on the hiring committee at my school, I know that we're very loyal to those teachers who come in as student teachers, and we try and find a place for them if we found them to be effective during their time at the school.
Don't be picky. Picky. I think your first job's your first job. You can leave after a year, you can leave after 2 years, but you need to get that first job before you can start to be picky. And that was something my mother taught me. You're not too good for anywhere, so apply everywhere and interview.
Yes?
You're gonna make my dream come true. I wanted to answer the question about finding a job. Independent schools are very interesting places to kind of start your career, I think. There are all kinds of placement agencies, especially the Carney Sando Placement Agency in Boston is a great place to start. It's almost kind of like applying to college. You have to write an educational philosophy, you have to have recs, you have to have your transcript, you have to have all those things. It's a whole application process. And many search placement agencies have the same exact process, so she would just have to replicate that for different agencies. Once you get into independent schools for a long period of time, like for example, I've been in for 14 years, I wouldn't go to a placement agency anymore because I've been in this circle long enough, and I know enough people now in different schools, and I've been to different conferences, and so I can send a letter out in a cold letter. But the other thing is that when you're looking at independent school teaching, you have the luxury of actually looking for a place that might fit your philosophical values. So one of the reasons why I wanted to teach in a girls' school in the first place was because I valued my Smith education. I had gone to public school all my life, K through 12, and Smith changed my life. And I wanted to give back to that desperately. And so that first moment at Young Women's was like, rah! And so that's how I wound up in independent schools. And so there's Quaker schools, you know all of this already. So you can pick the school that fits your educational kind of philosophical values if that's a path that she wants to take.
Yes.
What do you do specifically in your classroom to address the teaching of 21st century skills, creativity, collaboration, communication, and cross-cultural understanding?
Come to the panel tomorrow.
Well, I would say just for me, I teach at an expeditionary learning school where twice a year the kids do an expedition, which means all 4 of their core classes are involved in some sort of long-term 4 to 8 week expedition where they learn about a topic in all 4 of their classes. It's connected to all their core classes, and then they put on some sort of high stakes, real world, authentic publication. So last year, our 10th grade history class did an expedition about the civil rights movement in Springfield, where they documented in writing and in film interviews with some of the people in Springfield who had led certain civil rights movements within the city. And the large-scale presentation was that they put on an exhibit in the Springfield History Museum that was on display all summer. And actually just a few months ago, the Library of Congress asked to archive the exhibit, and they did archive it. And so now our kids have an exhibit archived in the Library of Congress that was about something very meaningful, the civil rights movement in Springfield. And so they're learning all of those, the connections between the core classes, the creativity is there, the publication work of editing film and interviewing skills, and then also that sort of sense of presenting that exhibit and making it look presentable, which has a big core, I think, to a lot of our 21st century jobs. How do you put together something and make it look presentable? And so I think our school does a good job of that because we're in the EL network.
Did you want to answer that question?
There and then there.
I have a question that kind of addresses one of the comments you made earlier on, and maybe Ileana can speak to, although everybody can, but Ileana might have a perspective working in the school. I'm in a position right now, I'm the alternate choice to go into education. So I've never been tenured. I lost my first job 2 years ago, and I've been doing maternity coverage the last 2 years. And I'm going to be in that same position on the end of that. And I know I'm a great teacher, but I realize that I've worked really hard. It's something I've made a conscientious decision to go into. And my observations are fantastic. My boss loves me, wants to keep me, but she can't because there's no openings. The guy who's retiring, that I was hoping to get a job, is now they're cutting the position. You know, it's the same situation. What do you see in your school and in Penn schools about, I mean, the tenure has its ups and its downs, as everybody will, I think, admit. What happens in an independent school if you're not a good teacher? I mean, some people aren't. So it's just, I don't know, I'm just curious about how do we get Smith women to want to go into a profession where they're not necessarily going to be valued for what they contribute, but how long they've been in them. And I think that's something that's hard. How do you persuade someone who's going to work really hard and be that Smith woman, but not necessarily going to be rewarded? Not even a reward. We're not looking to kind of create. We're looking to be valued for our work and our contributions. How do we deal with that? That's just a question. And I'm just wondering if how you have seen it being in the Penn schools.
I am that teacher who feels sometimes like I work really hard and not always very valued. And so I think it's really hard. And I will be honest with you that there are moments where I feel really angry and I feel really resentful. The other side of that is, in my own teaching life, I've had to kind of find the places for the oases, for the people who are really going to be my allies. Like, who are the other colleagues in my school who believe in what I do, who are like-minded, who are going to help me do that assembly. I mean, I'm going to try to answer like 3 questions here, which is, there was the question about creativity, communication, collaboration. You know, when my students put on that GEMS assembly, that's a big deal. They're getting up in front of their entire school and they're saying, we just learned about sex trafficking and we're going to teach you about this. They write the script, they invite the GEMS outreach workers to come and watch them. They get up there with their mics. I'm not up there. They run that whole thing. I think I do have colleagues who think, wow, Ileana gets a lot of airtime. You know, like she's got this like slot in the assembly schedule, right? And so I think we do a lot of work. I think Smith women, Smith teachers do a lot of work, and sometimes we don't feel valued for everything that we do. How do we take care of ourselves? In many different ways. How do we find a job? I mean, asking about, I mean, I run a listserv of jobs. So if you want to connect with me later, I can forward you some stuff. But I think your question of how do you get rid of terrible teachers in independent schools? Some schools, my school has a union. It's in a very unusual school in that it's a private school with a union. So we actually do have a process that's connected to the UFT. But in other schools, they just kind of float and stay, and they retired at, it's a really late age, and then they get all the benefits there. And it's really hard because you feel as though you're working really hard and other people aren't. And I really think it depends on the independent school. Some of them do get rid of them really quickly, depending on the context of that school or the head of school, and what kind of complaints are charged against that teacher. But in general, independent schools are pretty, or tend to be kind of wary of that unless it's a really serious situation.
Do you have anything you want to add? I forgot to ask people to introduce themselves, so if you would, just introduce yourself and maybe your class.
My name is Ingrid Boucher, class of 96. I currently spend much of my professional focus on teacher quality and effectiveness. And I've been watching with fascination and great anticipation over the last year or so as Race to the Top has prioritized higher stakes evaluation for teachers. So actually a related question, but for the focus of the folks. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on, what do you think are the best practices or the directions that we should be moving in if we're truly concerned about teacher quality and effectiveness? What have you seen that's worked? What do you wish you had that you don't have? What are your thoughts?
So I just quickly want to say that I think our idea of 3 months of student teaching needs to go. Right now I have a 180-day student in my classroom. That means they student teach, their graduate students at UMass who student teach for 180 days. And I think it should be at least 180 days of student teaching because you just don't learn in 3 months what you need to know. And I like also the programs that have almost like a residency for teaching, where you do 2 years of paid work, but you're really just like an assistant, an intern learning from a mentor teacher. I think mentor programs have their benefits, but the ones I've been in have not necessarily provided those. And I think supervisors need to really know the craft of teaching and how to assess and evaluate their teachers, and you need to be supervised more than 3 times a year in order to be told if you're doing a good job or not. And you also need to be sensitively told that. There's times when my supervisor's been in my class and I wanted to go home and cry first thing. So I don't want to hear that was an awful class, But I do need to know how to make it better. So I think really increasing our ability to supervise and help teachers to cultivate their skills and their craft with a mentor teacher, doing a residency, or having just a really strong supervisor is what needs to happen.
One of the things that I really appreciated during my first year teaching was that my principal had a focus on the 7 Teach for America teachers, making sure that we had a strong support system. And he would come in every single day. It would be a 5-minute visit. Sometimes he'd say 20 minutes, and he would write down every question that you asked your student. And then at the end of the day, you'd have your little yellow memo pad note in your mailbox, and you'd be able to evaluate, which questions were higher level thinking, which questions were just simple recall. And going through that process every single day with either him or our instructional liaison specialist really got you to a point where you were able to understand how you were challenging the students, and if you weren't, how you needed to push yourself. And I feel like that was a practice that really helped me as a teacher to be able to move beyond, what do you think is right here, and really pushing them to go to a deeper level. So I feel like having that support from the leader is extremely important. But then I also feel like you get to a point as a teacher and everybody says, okay, you made it past 5 years, you're good, and everything kind of falls off. And so I think with your professional growth, not that you become a bad teacher, but just that you're kind of remaining stagnant unless you're pushing yourself or in a school that's really pushing all of the teachers. And one of the things I'm excited about in the state of Georgia is that they're rolling out a new evaluation system now. And part of it is really encouraging teachers to collaborate. Like they're actually going to be looking to make sure that you're working together and giving you the opportunity to self-assess. You know, what are the things that I do well? What are the things that I do wrong? And they're considering a proposal now where teachers can be paired together so that you'll work in groups with those people who have something, the same growth areas that they need to work on, so that you can meet with your principal and other leaders in the district to focus on that. And one of the things that I think would be very valuable, when you are going through student teaching, you get a chance to observe a lot of great teachers, but then, you know, that becomes kind of an awkward thing once you're a veteran teacher, nobody wants to do it. But I think it's really powerful when you walk into a room and you ask to borrow something and you see something and the way that another teacher is teaching a lesson that you never thought of. And so I think if we could push it so that that becomes something that's normal and something that's encouraged to help you in your growth, whether you're a senior in college or you've been teaching 15 years, having that opportunity to do a pop-in visit during your break and observe another teacher, I think would expand your knowledge base and also the way that you're teaching a lesson. And so that's something that I would encourage.
If I could just add, one of the things that my organization has encouraged in the Valley and beyond, because we can do it through distance learning, are professional learning communities. And we have professional learning communities not only in subject areas, but in particular ELL teachers are few and far between in rural Massachusetts and probably in rural everywhere. So this gives them an opportunity to have collegiality, compare, contrast, learn from one another, and it doesn't need to be done in person. It can be done online, or it can be done through discussion groups or through distance learning. So I would encourage those of you who feel isolated in your schools to look for a way of forming a professional learning community with your peers and colleagues, other teachers in schools in your districts, so that you do have that give and take continually. I think we have time for, no, we don't have time for one more question. I'm being cut off. But we have several more panels tomorrow, so please come with your questions, and thank you all for being good listeners and good participants.